All right, what's this QB question?
Yeah.
Because if this is based off the email that I saw come in, I didn't even want to acknowledge it. But let me see which one.
The Stacy Jacobs email.
I don't remember who it was specifically.
Okay, so it's a good email that maybe goes a little bit far.
The one that attacked you?
Yeah. It attacks both of us. Goes a little bit far in some of the conclusions, but I think generally is an interesting point, and some of it is fair. So let me start reading this and potentially adjust for brevity. Hello, Sam and Steve. You make a lot of assertions and declarations of what kind, I'm going to be using air quotes a lot in this because there are some, of quarterback you can win with, and you have zero direct data that shows causation to back up any of your assertions. Being an atheist myself, okay, it's a little frustrating that the vague way you use kind gives you a whole lot of wiggle room to move the goalposts. As a matter of fact, just looking at the kind of quarterbacks that have appeared in the Super Bowl since 2017, that's the date that Sam said everything has changed in regards to what kind of quarterbacks win, refutes your hypothesis. Let's look at those Super Bowls. 2017, Nick Foles versus Brady, Brady Goff, Mahomes Jimmy G, Brady Mahomes, Stafford Burrow, Mahomes Jalen Hurts. If more quarterbacks playing the Super Bowl are outliers to your hypothesis of the kind of quarterbacks that win, then your hypothesis is shit. Start over. I'm sorry that you and the rest of the NFL media hates pocket passers, but it would appear they're still pretty successful. Yes, Joe Burrow is a pocket passer. So are Matthew Stafford, Tom Brady, Jimmy G, Jared Goff, and Nick Foles. Here's what you need to do. In your deep dive, please specifically define what kind means when referring to the kind of quarterbacks that win. Please define what wins means. Is it the Super Bowl? Keep your goalposts in place. Joe Burrow is a pocket passer, and you can't claim he isn't because he's good. Watch that confirmation bias. When the kind of quarterback that wins loses a bunch, don't start pretending he's not your kind. If I'm standing by quarterbacks like Burrow, Stafford, Carr, etc., or their ability to win a Super Bowl, state your kind and stand by it. And then there's a bunch of waffle. Thanks, Stacy Jacobs. So I think this is a reasonable discussion to have because it is true that we have made some declarations as to the kind of quarterbacks that can and can't win.
It's mostly you.
Sure. And it's usually specifically aimed at the ones that can't, right? So you can't, quote unquote, win a Super Bowl with Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so a couple of things I think that are issues, right?
The whole email. I didn't even want to acknowledge the whole email.
I know.
Because I thought it was I think it was missing the mark a little bit, but we've got something to respond to.
I mean, it's driving at something I think that's taking it too far. But I think the point, at least initially, is reasonable, which is, look, you're making these declarations as to who and who can't win a Super Bowl. And if you look at the actual Super Bowls, that's not how it stacks up. And then there's a discussion to be had about pocket passers relative to these athletic quarterbacks where the league seems to be trending at the moment. So the first point I think that is a problem is obviously everybody's goal, theoretically, is to win the Super Bowl, right? So we have this zero-sum game where if you win the Super Bowl, you got it right. If you don't win the Super Bowl, you got it wrong. And only one of those teams gets that every given year. So number one, Tom Brady skews everything, right? And always has throughout his entire career.
Yes.
If you're looking at anything, most of the Super Bowls contain Tom Brady. So if you're trying to make analysis based off who was in the Super Bowl, immediately your analysis trend is going to be wrecked by the one guy that's in most of them.
Can we start with that point then?
Well, I got a connected one that you can start with.
Okay.
The second point is, and I've made this point throughout entirety, is anytime your argument is sort of like, let's look at the Super Bowl winners, and that's how you decide what can and can't happen, it's just a bunk way of working anything. Now, limiting it to 2017 is a reasonable start because my usual point is the game is so different. If you go back, 10 years, you can't pull anything meaningful from watching 2007 games relative to games right now. I know 2007 is not 10 years from 2023, but you get my point. You go back far enough, the game is so different, it's so hard to try and act like it's adjusting for era in the Super Bowls. We know you have to adjust for era in the NFL, but then when it comes to Super Bowls, we conveniently forget that and go, oh, if you just look at all the quarterbacks that did whatever in the Super Bowl, you can't win. So that generally doesn't work. And then two, if you do limit it to 2017 and start working from there, now you're dealing with a sample size of 6, which just is pointless. Like a sample size of 6 is irrelevant for anything.
Yeah.
So the entire premise is difficult when you're starting with this idea of let's see who can and can't win a Super Bowl based off who has made the Super Bowl.
All right, so let's unpack some of this stuff here. Let's just start during the Tom Brady era.
Okay.
In the NFL. So he enters the league in 2000. He becomes a starter in 2001. The Patriots go from a 5-win team to winning the Super Bowl in 2001. Defense or not, Tom Brady's a big part of that, right? So since 2001, between 2001 and 2022, Tom Brady wins 7 as the starting quarterback. Mahomes has 2. Peyton Manning has 2. Drew Brees and Aaron Rodgers each have 1 apiece. If you said since 2001, who are the elite quarterbacks in the NFL? It's that group. Right, it's pretty clearly that group in their own tier of quarterback. They win 13 out of 22 Super Bowls. That's 59%, right? So this happens in recruiting a lot. When people that work in the recruiting industry, and you see these articles every year where it's like, this year, half the first rounders were 3-star players. And it's like, yeah, but you're pulling from a pool of thousands. The other half were, say, 4 or 5-star players. You're pulling from a pool of hundreds, and there's only like 35 stars every year. And overall, they do well for a group of 30 players. That's the elite quarterbacks, right? When elite quarterbacks have won 59% of the last 22 Super Bowls, that's a pretty strong number. Because some people, well, what about the other 40%? There's 40% of non-elite quarterbacks that have won. And that's what most teams have. But yeah, when 5 quarterbacks win 59% of the Super Bowls, the elite quarterback is the obvious cheat code. And this probably goes, and it goes back to, hey, Joe Montana as the quarterback of the 49ers. And then you'd say, well, the Dolphins had Dan Marino. Yeah, and they didn't win any. That's still the best strategy. The best strategy back in the 80s was still having Dan Marino and building around him and having the elite quarterback. So that's like the starting point of when we talk about kinds and types and all that stuff, the kind is elite no matter what they do.
Right.
And then if you want to say, okay, what is their style? I mean, their style is win from the pocket, but also win everywhere.
Yeah.
Like all those guys, Rodgers and Brees and Brady, like they don't all look the same in how they play, but they all are the best.
Yeah, I think this email is conflating 2 different points that we've been making. Number one, your starting point, as you say, has to be, I need an elite quarterback. Like, I want Patrick Mahomes or the next Patrick Mahomes. And if I can't have that guy, I want the closest thing to him. And then the further away from Patrick Mahomes you get, the harder it is to win the Super Bowl, essentially. Like, that's basically the very simple crayons version of what every team in the NFL is doing right now. Can we agree on that?
Yes.
Like, you want Patrick Mahomes, and if you don't have Patrick Mahomes, the further away from him you are at the most important position in the game, the harder it is going to be to win a Super Bowl. Particularly now, and the idea of 2017 being the time that changes everything, yes, because that's when these guys start to come into the NFL. But like the more, in the last couple of years, this is only being magnified because now, even if Mahomes doesn't make the Super Bowl, Joe Burrow will, or Josh Allen will, or like there's so many of these guys now. So if you're going to make that run, if you're going to be the team that makes it, it's so hard right now because of just the quality that stands in front of you. And then the second part, so the first part is that's your starting point, and that starts to raise questions about players like Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, Dak Prescott, guys that are clearly a step below that level. How big a step is up for debate, but we can all agree that none of those guys are in the Patrick Mahomes bracket of quarterbacks, right? The second point, I think, which has been lumped together with this one, but is a different one, is has there been a shift in the style of quarterback that is now the modern prototype, right? And before, for years it was Tom Brady and Peyton Manning were the 2 best quarterbacks in the NFL. They were both relatively immobile pocket passers. Therefore, that was the prototype. That's what everybody wanted, right? But this has always been cyclical. Like we talked before about when we did that oral history of the Joe Montana versus Steve Young thing. When Montana first came on the scene, when you watch those games, you would hear every single game of his early career, somebody, John Madden or whoever the commentator was, would start talking about what a miracle it was that this guy could scramble a little bit. And then Joe Montana was an order of magnitude worse in terms of athleticism and mobility than Steve Young, who came into the NFL, essentially took his job later on. And then even Steve Young is an order of magnitude behind the likes of Lamar Jackson, right? It's a different, there's a whole scale of this. But even Joe Montana kind of started that whole trend again of we need scramblers, we need guys that can move around. And then Brett Favre, that was part of his sales pitch as well. He would scramble around. Steve Young, obviously, like that became in vogue. And then it swung back towards the Brady and Peyton Manning guys because they were the best. It goes in cycles, right? So we may have just got out of this era of Brady Manning, and now the best quarterbacks are Mahomes, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow. And yes, Joe Burrow is a pocket passer, but he's also of the Joe Montana, hey, look at him scramble around a bit.
Yeah, I mean, he's still more pocket passer than runaround guy,
of course,
obviously. That's part of the point of the email.
But he's also a significantly more mobile quarterback than Brady and Manning, right? So I think my only point that I think I've made with those guys is if you're Peyton Manning or Tom Brady, like the elite of the elite, any style works, right? But we have reached a point where I think the window to hit, if you're looking at a draft prospect who comes into the NFL and you're like, this guy cannot move. He is stuck in the pocket. He is a statue back there. He brings zero athleticism, like a negative degree of athleticism. That's our prospect here. He needs to be so good now at everything else to offset that.
Yeah.
So, and we've seen that in recent years. There have been a few of those guys come into the league, and it's like, that guy cannot move. Carson Strong from Nevada. Fantastic in the pocket, could not move, and he's now playing in one of the spring leagues, or was last time I saw.
You can make the same point about Kirk Cousins, that I know he outran Zach Allen one time, but Kirk Cousins isn't going to do anything with his legs.
Right.
Which is fine. Like, you could still win with a Kirk Cousins-style quarterback. He just has to play because the margin for error is different.
Yeah.
So he has to play at a Brady, Peyton, Breeze type of level consistently, which he doesn't.
Right. But my overall point now is that I think we have reached a point where the prototype for an elite quarterback involves some form of athleticism. That the thing that we've done before with the draft stuff, or that everybody does in the summer and the off season, it's like build the perfect quarterback. It's got Mahomes' arms, it's got Josh Allen's size, all that kind of crap. That now contains some level of athleticism in a way that it didn't necessarily before. So
I'm going to take a slightly different, gray area approach to this. I mean, yeah, we shouldn't be making declarations that, it's you got to have a pocket passer, you have to have a mobile quarterback. Do you have to win most of the time from the pocket? Yes, absolutely you do.
Right.
But the point we always brought up about mobility is it gives you more ability to win from the pocket because of what the stress that it brings to the defense. It comes down to your whole sliders argument. When you're talking about draft prospects, I'm going to put arm strength up and accuracy's down, and if I move these sliders, of course pocket passers can still win. And throw Joe Burrow into that bucket. Joe Burrow is probably playing. He looks like he's going to be in that elite quarterback mix.
Yeah.
Much like like the Bradys and Breezes in Rodgers for years to come, right? So of course you can win with Joe Burrow. But when you don't have those guys, here's how I'm going to position it, Sam. I always say EPA is a team stat, right? Expected points added. Mm-hmm. Your goal, so I don't think EPA is just like directly quarterback driven, right? But your goal is to create EPA, which leads to points, and put the most points on the board. So you're just doing whatever it can to create the most efficient offense. And if you have a guy that's a 99, for lack of a better, Madden term, in pocket presence and accuracy and decision making like Brady or Peyton, that's fine. Use that. But when a guy's only a 90 or an 88 or an 85 or an 80, you have to pull from somewhere else to get that EPA number for your team higher. You have to steal yards with your legs like Daniel Jones did last year. You have to build your run game around the quarterback's running ability like a Jalen Hurts did last year to get your offense to play at a high level. So it just comes down to that. I don't think there's a type or a style or anything. It's just if you look and you say, this guy's not Brady, Peyton, Breeze, then he better have something else. Because if he plays like those guys and not at their level, it's not going to work. Just like if a guy is only a runner and he can't hit a pass, that's not going to work either.
The sliders is a good it's a good thing to bring up, I think, because for anyone that doesn't remember, this theory I had is that look, when you're talking about a guy that's sufficiently deficient in one of these areas, he's got to be amazing at two of the other ones, right? So I had this three-pronged approach of arm strength, accuracy, and then decisions and anticipation when you're throwing the ball. And the theory is if you are bad at any one of those things...
Using crayon.
Yeah. If the slider is way down on any one of those things, it's got to be way up on the other two. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And if you're bad at two of them, you have basically no shot of working at the NFL. So that's the way this theory started off. And I was actually thinking relatively recently that you now need to add a fourth slider to this. Like you now need to add athleticism, mobility to that group. And if you're going to stink from an athleticism standpoint, you need to be maxed out at basically the other ones, right? And I think that's now forced its way into that conversation. So I think that's a good way of putting it, that it's not that you cannot win without athleticism. Tom Brady was still successful at 45 years old right up until the end. You can obviously still win with that, but your default starting position should now be, I want that because it's important. And if I don't have it, I need to have the guy really, really good at the other stuff to offset that. The other element in all this, right, is it's hyperbole, right? We're going to be talking about can't, can as these definitive statements, when clearly if you've listened to the show for any period of time, you will know that we are well aware of the folly of making definitive statements like that. Like Nick Foles won a Super Bowl, for God's sake. Of course you can win a Super Bowl with basically any quarterback if the stars align and everything goes in your direction. But that required Nick Foles having two of the most insane postseason performances of all time to happen. What we're talking about here is the distribution of outcomes, right? If you go into a single season with Kirk Cousins as your quarterback, what are your chances of winning a Super Bowl? And my suggestion to that would be pretty minimal. It can happen, obviously, but is it likely to happen? No.
Yeah, so I'm going to take time to go back through the outliers then, right? If we say that since 2001, 13 Super Bowls have been won by elite quarterbacks, 7 by Tom Brady, who again skews all the numbers.
Right.
It goes back to your original point. We shouldn't start with, well, here's what all Super Bowl winners do. All you have to do is X. All you have to do is have Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes.
By the way, just before you do that quickly, even just changing the final determiner from made Super Bowl to won Super Bowl changes your outcome a little bit. Even just the 2017 thing. Okay, Nick Foles got his, good work, but then Brady beat Goff, Mahomes beat Jimmy G, Brady versus Mahomes, whatever, it's a wash. Stafford beat Burrow, but that was Stafford playing like an elite quarterback for that run, and then Mahomes beat Hurts. So even just changing, who made it versus who won, changes how you're going to look at that.
Yeah, so there's a chunk of elite quarterbacks that either made it or won it, obviously. The Stafford one's a good example, right? Because there was a point way back when we started podcasting just a little bit, 2012 and 13, there was a point in the NFL where in 2011, the Giants won it, and in 2012, the Ravens won it. And then the talking point became, and we were doing this back then, you just need a guy capable of going on a run. Yeah. I mean, good luck figuring it out. Could you have figured Joe Flacco going on a run?
Oh.
Joe Flacco was a good NFL quarterback. He was in the middle of his worst season in 2012. The offensive coordinator got fired.
Both Joe Flacco and Eli Manning probably don't see a second contract if they don't go on the run that they went to win a Super Bowl.
And Eli, they're both good NFL quarterbacks. Eli was a good NFL quarterback. And for 2 years, 2011 and 12, he was like top 5. Ridiculous. He was unbelievable under pressure. And for Flacco, for about 10 games, 6 in the regular season and 4 in the playoffs, was outstanding in the 2012 run. You could put Stafford kind of into that bucket. I think Stafford has been a better quarterback over the course of his career. We've done this exercise a lot, rank the quarterbacks of the last 15 years in the era. And Stafford's right around 10 to 12. That's just where he is. You're not going to put him above Ben Roethlisberger. You're not going to put him above Matt Ryan still in their primes. But Stafford went on a run the same way a Flacco or an Eli did. So there's a chunk of quarterbacks who did that. There's a Foles, who's a massive outlier, went on a 2-game run, but also was saddled with probably the best team in the NFL that year, all-around team with the Eagles, right? I mean, there's Cam Newton was another went on a run guy. If we're honest about Cam Newton's career, he was just like an Eli or he's better than Flacco, but he's kind of like an Eli, maybe a touch better. He was a good NFL quarterback. He was fine. He had 1 year of elite play, and they went to the Super Bowl. So, yeah, I mean, you can first off, we shouldn't just use Super Bowl winners. You should probably use Final Four teams as a starting point. You could use 10-win teams or whatever. I don't know. But it usually points to elite quarterbacks being the cheat code, and that's why we always say chase that if you don't have it yet. And if you don't have it, you have to use everything else in your quarterback skill set to maximize him. There is no certain type. You have to just play to his strengths and build a great team around him. That's the key.
And none of this stuff happens in a vacuum. That last point you made, you have to build a great team around him, is obviously an important part. So when you're looking at all these quarterbacks, whether it's won the Super Bowl, made Super Bowl, Final Four, whatever, you have to look at the teams around them. You know, Jared Goff, Matthew Stafford, Sean McVay's Rams team built around those guys. Like, these are important factors that you have to look at, but it muddies the picture, like, which is the whole point in all this. Like, that's why the basic point, if you're the back of a napkin version of this, is you want Patrick Mahomes. That's your starting point. If you can't have him, you want as close to Mahomes as possible, and the further away from you get from him, the better everything else needs to be. The better your team, coach, supporting cast, receivers, all that stuff needs to be for it to happen. And it can happen because we've seen Nick Foles, we've seen Jared Goff go to a Super Bowl, we've seen Matthew Stafford win a Super Bowl. It's obviously possible, but it means like the chances of it happening, like the odds you're shooting with are much smaller. Whereas if you have Patrick Mahomes, you can still do all that other stuff. You can still construct the greatest roster of all time around him. And if you do, that team becomes almost unstoppable. Like, the point is, it's just you start from that you're born on third base, like metaphor. Like, if you have Patrick Mahomes as your quarterback, you start the season on third base, and all you got to do is like not screw it up and get home, right? Whereas all these other teams, if you're starting with wherever your quarterback is, somewhere below that, if you're starting with Kirk Cousins, Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, or further down the list, like these Kenny Pickett, right? You can still win a Super Bowl. It's possible for pretty much anybody. But now, not only are you not starting on third base, you're like down 5 runs in the 9th inning. Like, it's possible to win from there. It's just a hell of a lot harder.
So I just to circle back to this.
Are you not a little bit impressed by my baseball analogy?
It's very good. There? It's very good.
They were actually sound. They worked.
Yeah. Third base, and you get a
down in the 9th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Right. See, and it added to the baseball talk.
Yeah, but it's good. 16-20. Look at us. We had some. Do we add to the rugby talk? We had my.
Oh, yeah, we got it. Don't worry.
My skull cap here.
Scrum cap.
What is it?
Scrum cap.
Scrum cap. Scully. They call it Scully.
No.
Scrummy? Do you call it a scrummy?
No.
Good. Good. So I mean, isn't this the impetus for a lot of our analysis here? Like, isn't this why we sit there around draft time and just say, like, just draft a bunch of quarterbacks? Because if you even look at tier 2 quarterbacks, so of the last 20 years, I think Big Ben and Russell Wilson have been tier 2 quarterbacks, below the elite quarterbacks. They've got 5 Super Bowl appearances between the two of them, and won 3. They're tier 2 quarterbacks. So if you just add tier 1 quarterbacks, the elites, and you add the tier 2 quarterbacks, Matt Ryan has a Super Bowl appearance, like, that's a big chunk of your Super Bowls. And it's by top 8 to 10 quarterbacks. That's why when Matthew Stafford wins a Super Bowl, like, we don't have to show up the next day and be like, is he a Hall of Famer? Is he just like Tom Brady and Peyton Manning and Drew Brees? Is he the same guy? It's like, no. He went on a good run. He's a tier 2 quarterback right now in this era, and he had a nice run for the Super Bowl. He's not a Hall of Famer. That's okay. Like, those guys win Super Bowls. It happens. It's fine. You don't have to put him in the Hall of Fame. The
last point, I think, to make on all this, so I think our main point is, look, anything can happen, generally. We've always been saying that, but for sake of concise, conversation and simple statements, we use hyperbole a bit more and say you can win with these guys, you can't win with these guys, or at least it's a hell of a lot harder. The second point to make, or the last point to make, is I assume Stacy is a woman. Maybe I'm getting that wrong. Could be, it's one of those androgynous names, right? Could be either, theoretically. But let's assume she's female for the moment.
Just say Stacy.
Okay. Stacy
don't need to make any assumptions.
You're right. That's
Either
foolish.
way.
You're right. Sensible point. Stacy has said that we've used basically zero data to back up any of these assertions one way or the other, which is, I think, a fair point. what I would say is I think that's extremely hard when you're talking about some of this stuff. This is why I'm very excited by the potential of something like the S2 cognition test, right? Because it can quantify something that as yet is kind of unquantifiable and intangible. So the difference between some of these tier 1 quarterbacks and tier 2 quarterbacks, it might be measurable, but only when you control for several other factors, which are, I think, more powerful in influencing stats. So what I'm saying is the difference between Kirk Cousins and Joe Burrow, I think, is probably smaller than the impact that the supporting cast for Joe Burrow and Kirk Cousins has on their statistical performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So essentially, it's too difficult to measure because it's being swayed by a bunch of other factors that are impossible to strip out of the conversation. So if you look at Kirk Cousins' statistics over his Minnesota career, effectively, right? You can find a bunch of stats that will put him in that bracket of the top quarterbacks. And yet everybody looking at these guys clearly knows there's a gap, right, between Kirk Cousins and Mahomes, Burrow, like the elite quarterbacks. We all acknowledge that. So you're inevitably led to this conclusion of, there's a gap that we're not measuring here, and I can't quantify what that is right now for you. Like, that's just the reality of the situation.